They found the cabin door locked from the inside. The bed was still made. 2 champagne glasses sat untouched on the nightstand, condensation long since evaporated. Eleanor and Thomas Hartwell had vanished from the MS Celestine somewhere between the coast of Florida and the open waters of the Caribbean, and for nearly 4 decades, no one knew why. No bodies, no ransom note, no witnesses, just an empty cabin, a locked door, and a mystery that would haunt everyone who touched it. But here's what nobody told you. Here's what the cruise line buried. Here's what the investigators missed. And here's why I've spent the last 3 years of my life piecing together what really happened to my grandparents on that ship in the summer of 1985. My name is Sarah Hartwell, and this is the story they never wanted you to hear. If you're watching this right now, I need you to do something for me before we go any further. This story took everything from my family. It destroyed my father. It shattered my grandmother's legacy. And the people responsible have lived comfortable lives for almost 40 years while we've been left with nothing but questions. So please, if you believe that the truth matters, if you believe that some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried, share this video. Subscribe to this channel. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a cold case. It's a cover-up. And the more people who know, the harder it becomes for them to keep hiding. Let me take you back. Let me show you who Eleanor and Thomas Hartwell really were before they became just another unsolved mystery, another statistic in a file cabinet somewhere gathering dust. Eleanor Grace Hartwell, my grandmother, was 53 years old in the summer of 1985. She had silver-streaked auburn hair that she wore pinned up in an elegant twist, and green eyes that my father said could see right through any lie you tried to tell. She'd been a bookkeeper for 30 years, first for a small accounting firm in Cleveland, then for larger and larger companies as her reputation for precision and discretion grew. By 1985, she was handling the financial records for Meridian Shipping, one of the largest cruise operators on the eastern seaboard. Thomas Hartwell, my grandfather, was a quieter soul. 57 years old, retired from the steel mills with a pension that wasn't quite enough and a bad back that reminded him every morning of the decades he'd spent on his feet. He loved crossword puzzles, old westerns, and my grandmother with a devotion that everyone who knew them described as almost otherworldly. They'd been married for 31 years. They had one son, my father David, who was 28 in 1985 and had just gotten engaged to my mother. The cruise was supposed to be a celebration. 31 years of marriage. Thomas's retirement. A new chapter beginning. Eleanor had gotten an incredible deal on the tickets, which should have been the first red flag, but wasn't. The MS Celestine was a mid-sized cruise ship, not one of the massive floating cities you see today, but respectable, comfortable, with a capacity of about 800 passengers and a crew of 300. They boarded on June 14, 1985, in Miami. The ship was bound for a 7-day Caribbean cruise with stops in Key West, Cozumel, Grand Cayman, and Jamaica. Eleanor had packed her nicest summer dresses. Thomas had brought 3 mystery novels and a brand new camera. They called my father from the port before boarding, and he would later tell me that his mother sounded happier than she had in months. That was the last time he ever heard her voice. The first 2 days of the cruise were, by all accounts, unremarkable. I've tracked down 3 passengers who were on that voyage, now in their 70s and 80s, and they all remember the Hartwells as a pleasant, quiet couple who kept mostly to themselves. They ate dinner at the early seating, took walks on the deck after sunset, and attended a magic show on the second night. Eleanor sent a postcard from Key West, which arrived at my father's apartment 2 weeks after she disappeared. It said, "Having a wonderful time. The water is bluer than any photograph could capture. Thomas is already sunburned. See you soon. Love, Mom. See you soon." The ship left Key West on the evening of June 16th, heading toward Cozumel. Somewhere in those dark waters, in those midnight hours between one port and the next, Eleanor and Thomas Hartwell ceased to exist. The cabin steward noticed first. Her name was Maria Gonzalez, and she was 22 years old, supporting her family back in Honduras with the money she sent home every month. Maria knocked on cabin 247 at 9 a.m. on June 17th, as she did every morning. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. The Do Not Disturb sign wasn't on the door, so after a third knock, she used her master key. The door didn't open. Something was blocking it from the inside. Maria called her supervisor. The supervisor called security. Security called the captain. And 45 minutes later, they finally forced the door open to find an empty cabin with a chair wedged under the handle, 2 champagne glasses, a made bed, and no sign of Thomas or Eleanor Hartwell. The balcony door was open. The curtains were moving in the morning breeze. And on the small table by the window sat something that would haunt me for years after I first learned about it. A single sheet of paper with 2 words written in my grandmother's careful handwriting. Forgive us. The official investigation lasted exactly 11 days. The cruise line's position was clear and unwavering. Thomas and Eleanor Hartwell had committed suicide together, jumping from their cabin balcony into the Caribbean Sea sometime during the night of June 16th. The locked door, they said, proved that no one else was involved. The note, they said, confirmed their intentions. The open balcony door, they said, told the rest of the story. Case closed. Tragedy. Nothing more to see here. My father didn't believe it. Not for a single second. And for the next 30 years of his life, until cancer took him in 2015, he fought to find out what really happened. He wrote letters. He filed lawsuits. He hired private investigators who took his money and delivered nothing. He became obsessed, and that obsession cost him his first marriage, his career, and eventually his relationship with me for almost a decade. I was ashamed of him. I thought he was chasing ghosts, refusing to accept a painful truth because the alternative was too terrible to bear. I thought he was destroying himself over a tragedy that was simply tragic. Nothing more, nothing sinister. Just 2 people who had reached the end of their rope and made an unimaginable choice together. I was wrong. My father was right. And it took me 3 years and 4 trips to 3 different countries to prove it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the things that didn't add up, the details that should have made everyone pause, the evidence that was ignored or buried or destroyed. Let me tell you about the chair. The chair that was wedged under the door handle of cabin 247 was a standard-issue stateroom desk chair, wooden with a padded seat covered in a burgundy fabric that matched the carpet. The cruise line's investigators noted it in their initial report and then promptly used it as evidence that the Hartwells had locked themselves in before taking their own lives. But here's what they didn't explain. Here's what nobody bothered to ask. If Thomas and Eleanor Hartwell wanted to commit suicide by jumping off their balcony, why would they need to lock the door from the inside? Who were they keeping out? And more importantly, why a chair under the handle when the door had a perfectly functional deadbolt? I found the answer in a box of my father's old files after he died. He had tracked down the cabin steward, Maria Gonzalez, in 1991. She had left the cruise industry by then, married, moved to Texas. And she told my father something she had never told the investigators, something that had haunted her for 6 years. When she first tried to open the door with her master key, it turned. The deadbolt wasn't engaged. The only thing stopping the door from opening was the chair. And when security finally forced the door, they didn't break the lock. They pushed hard enough to slide the chair across the carpet. Think about that for a moment. If you're planning to kill yourself, if you've decided that tonight is the night you and your spouse of 31 years are going to jump off a balcony together, would you leave the deadbolt unlocked? Would you rely on a chair that could be pushed aside with enough force? It makes no sense. Unless you're not the one who put the chair there. Maria told my father something else, something that made him drive to Texas twice more before she finally refused to see him again. On the night of June 16th, around 11 o'clock, Maria had been doing her final rounds of the corridor. She passed cabin 247 and heard voices inside. Multiple voices. At least 3, maybe 4. She couldn't make out words, but she could hear the tone. It wasn't an argument exactly, but it wasn't casual conversation either. It sounded, she said, like a negotiation. Like people trying very hard to stay calm while discussing something that wasn't calm at all. She didn't report it. She didn't knock on the door. Passengers had guests in their cabins all the time, and as long as there wasn't screaming or obvious distress, crew members were trained to look the other way. She walked past, finished her rounds, went to bed. And the next morning, She found the cabin empty and the Hartwells gone. For 30 years, that guilt ate at her. She told my father she still dreamed about it sometimes, still wondered what would have happened if she had knocked, if she had asked if everything was okay, if she had broken protocol and intervened. She told him she was sorry. She told him she wished she could have done something. And then she asked him to please stop contacting her because she couldn't bear to remember anymore. My father never told me about Maria Gonzalez. He never told me about the unlocked deadbolt or the voices in the cabin. By the time I started looking into this case myself, 3 years ago, Maria had passed away. Stroke, 2018. But her daughter still had the letters my father sent, still had the notes from their conversations, still had a tape recording of their final meeting where Maria broke down crying and begged for forgiveness from a woman she had never met but could have saved. I'm going to stop here for a moment because I need to ask you something. I've been carrying this story alone for 3 years. I've been piecing it together in spare rooms and rented offices, drowning in documents and dead ends, and the kind of bureaucratic resistance that tells you someone doesn't want you to find what you're looking for. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wonder if I'm making the same mistake my father made. I wonder if I'm destroying my own life, chasing something that will never give me peace. So here's my question, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Leave it in the comments below. If you discovered that someone you loved had been hiding a dangerous secret, a secret that ultimately led to their death, would you want to know the truth? Even if the truth changed how you remembered them? Even if the truth meant they weren't quite the person you thought they were? Think about it. Answer honestly. Because what I'm about to tell you about my grandmother is going to change everything. Eleanor Hartwell was a bookkeeper. I told you that already. I told you she worked for Meridian Shipping, one of the largest cruise operators on the eastern seaboard. What I didn't tell you, what I didn't know until I spent 6 months digging through archived financial records that should have been destroyed decades ago, is what Eleanor Hartwell found in those books. Meridian Shipping was a criminal enterprise. It had been since its founding in 1971. On paper, they ran legitimate cruise operations, mid-market vacation packages for middle-class families and retirees. In reality, they were moving money, massive amounts of money, drug money, primarily, laundered through a complex system of passenger manifests that didn't match actual headcounts, fake maintenance expenses, phantom supply orders, and shell companies registered in the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands. My grandmother figured it out within her first year working there. She was too good at her job not to notice. The numbers didn't add up, couldn't add up, unless someone was deliberately manipulating them. And once she started looking, once she started making copies of documents and cross-referencing accounts, she discovered the scope of what she was dealing with. Between 1978 and 1985, Meridian Shipping moved an estimated $47 million through their cruise operations. That's nearly $130 million in today's money. And my grandmother had the evidence to prove it. But here's where the story gets complicated. Here's where I had to confront something about my grandmother that I never expected. She didn't go to the police. She didn't blow the whistle. She didn't do the right thing and expose the criminals she was working for. She started taking money. Small amounts at first. A few thousand here, a few thousand there, skimmed from accounts that were already fraudulent. Who would notice? Who would care? The people above her were stealing millions, destroying communities with the drugs they were helping to distribute. What was a few $1,000s to a bookkeeper who had spent her entire life just getting by? By 1985, my grandmother had taken almost $200,000 from Meridian Shipping. She had hidden it in accounts across 4 different banks, using her expertise to create exactly the kind of paper trail she had once been hired to untangle. She was planning to retire in 3 years, move somewhere warm with my grandfather, leave the whole ugly business behind. And then someone at Meridian noticed the discrepancies. I don't know who discovered it. I don't know exactly when the investigation into my grandmother began. What I do know is that by early June of 1985, someone at the company had flagged the missing funds. Someone had started asking questions. And someone had decided that Eleanor Hartwell was a problem that needed to be solved. The cruise tickets. The incredible deal she got on a 7-day Caribbean voyage. That wasn't luck. And it wasn't a reward for years of good service. It was an invitation, a trap, a way to get my grandmother onto a ship, away from witnesses, away from land, where whatever needed to happen could happen cleanly and quietly. And my grandmother knew. That's what I finally understood after 3 years of investigation. She knew they were coming for her. She knew the cruise was dangerous. She knew that the walls were closing in and that her options were running out. So why did she get on that ship? Why did she bring my grandfather into a situation she knew was lethal? Why didn't she run, or confess, or do anything other than walk straight into the hands of the people who wanted her dead? I found the answer in a safe deposit box in Akron, Ohio. It had been dormant for 38 years, the rental fees quietly paid by an automatic transfer from an account I didn't know existed until an elderly bank employee contacted me after reading one of my online posts about the case. Inside the box, there were 3 things. A manila envelope containing 37 pages of documentation that proved, beyond any shadow of doubt, that Meridian Shipping was a front for the Calabrese crime family out of Miami. A handwritten letter from my grandmother to my father that she never got the chance to mail. And a photograph. The photograph showed a man in his 40s, dark hair, expensive suit, standing on the deck of a cruise ship. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, were 3 words that answered every question I had about why she made the choices she made. He has David. My grandmother didn't get on that cruise ship because she was naive or hopeful or desperate. She got on because they threatened to kill her son, my father. They had him, or at least they made her believe they did, and the only way to keep him alive was to deliver herself to them, to give them back the money and the evidence and anything else they wanted. The letter she wrote to my father explained everything. She told him about the embezzlement. She told him about Meridian. She told him about the years of silence and shame and the weight of the secret she had carried. And she told him that she was going to fix it, that she was going to make a deal, that she was going to ensure his safety, even if it cost her everything. She never got to send the letter because she never got off the ship, but she put it in that safe deposit box along with the evidence, along with the photograph, along with everything she had gathered over 7 years of working for criminals. And she left instructions with a lawyer in Akron, a man named Harold Finch who died in 1992 and whose firm had long since forgotten about the arrangement, that if she didn't return from her vacation, the contents of the box should be delivered to the FBI. Something went wrong. Harold Finch never followed through. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he was paid off. Maybe he was threatened too. Whatever the reason, the evidence sat in that box for 38 years while my father destroyed himself searching for answers that were waiting in a bank vault 70 miles from where he grew up. I cried when I opened that box. I sat in the sterile little room they give you at the bank, surrounded by my grandmother's secrets, and I cried until I couldn't breathe. I cried for her, for the impossible choice she made. I cried for my grandfather, who walked into that trap because he loved her too much to let her face it alone. I cried for my father, who spent his whole life fighting for the truth and died without ever finding it. And then I got angry. The man in the photograph was named Vincent Calabrese. He was 44 years old in 1985, the youngest son of Dominic Calabrese, who ran the Miami family until his death in 1991. Vincent was the legitimate face of the operation, the one who dealt with banks and politicians and businessmen who wanted to pretend they didn't know where the money came from. He oversaw Meridian Shipping. He had discovered my grandmother's betrayal, and according to a source I found years later, he was on the MS Celestine the night she disappeared. The passenger manifest for that voyage has been officially lost. Meridian Shipping was bought by another company in 1987, and most of their records were destroyed during the transition. But I found a crew member, a bartender named Eduardo Santos, who was 67 years old when I tracked him down in Puerto Rico, and he remembered Vincent Calabrese. He remembered because Calabrese was a big tipper and because Calabrese had a private meeting in the ship's conference room on the night of June 16th. Eduardo had been asked to bring champagne to that meeting. 2 bottles of Veuve Clicquot. He delivered them around 10 o'clock and saw, through the briefly open door, 4 men in suits and a woman with silver-streaked auburn hair sitting at the table with her hands folded in her lap. My grandmother. In a meeting with Vincent Calabrese. An hour before she disappeared. Eduardo didn't see my grandfather, But Thomas Hartwell wasn't the type to stay behind while his wife walked into danger. If Eleanor was in that conference room, Thomas was somewhere close. Maybe held by security. Maybe locked in their cabin. Maybe already dead, though I don't believe that. The champagne glasses in cabin 247, the ones that were never touched, suggest that whatever happened occurred before there was time to celebrate. I tried to find Vincent Calabrese. He's still alive, 84 years old now, living in a gated community in Boca Raton with his third wife and 2 small dogs. I wrote him letters. I called his house. I even drove down to Florida and sat outside his gate for 3 days, waiting for a chance to confront him. His lawyer sent me a cease and desist order. His security called the police. And when I finally got a message through, the response was 4 words delivered by a man who knew exactly who I was and exactly what I wanted. There's nothing to discuss. But Vincent Calabrese made a mistake when he dismissed me so easily. He assumed I was just like my father, a grieving family member with no resources and no connections, banging my fists against walls that would never break. He didn't know that I had spent 12 years as an investigative journalist before my father's death sent me down this rabbit hole. He didn't know that I had contacts at 3 federal agencies and a very good relationship with a now-retired prosecutor who had spent his career trying to build cases against the Calabrese family. And he didn't know that I had one more piece of evidence, something even my grandmother hadn't known about, something that would change everything. Thomas Hartwell, my quiet grandfather who loved crossword puzzles and old westerns, had brought a camera on that cruise. A brand new camera, the letters said, purchased specifically for the trip. And cameras, as anyone who grew up in the pre-digital age can tell you, used film. Film that had to be developed. Film that could survive almost anything if it was protected properly. In 2019, a fishing boat operating out of Key West brought up a strange catch in their nets. A barnacle-encrusted metal box, sealed tight, heavy and rectangular, clearly man-made but unidentifiable. The captain, a man named Jorge Delgado, took it back to shore out of curiosity. Inside the box, protected from the salt water by the airtight seal, was a camera. An old camera, a 1985 Minolta X700. Jorge Delgado is a true crime enthusiast. He has a website where he posts about cold cases from South Florida, and he wrote about the camera because he thought it might be connected to some maritime mystery. I found that post because I had set up Google alerts for every combination of words related to the MS Celestine, and camera and 1985 and Caribbean were enough to trigger my notification. It took me 6 months to convince Jorge to let me see the camera. It took another 4 months to find a specialty lab that could attempt to recover the film, which had been corroded but not destroyed by the small amount of seawater that seeped in over the decades. And it took 3 more months of waiting, of hoping, of praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore, before I finally got the call. 11 photographs were recoverable. Most were vacation shots, exactly what you would expect. My grandmother smiling on the deck. My grandfather looking sunburned and happy. The port at Key West. A sunset over the water. But 3 of those photographs changed everything. The first showed the conference room of the MS Celestine. For men in suits. My grandmother at the table. And in the corner, almost out of frame, a 5th man holding what appeared to be a gun. The second showed the deck of the ship at night. A woman being held by 2 men. A man lying on the ground, struggling. And in the background, the unmistakable silhouette of Vincent Calabrese watching. The third showed the water. Just the water, dark and featureless. But in the corner, barely visible, was a hand reaching up from the waves. Someone had photographed what happened that night. Someone had captured evidence of what the Calabrese family did to my grandparents. And someone had thrown that camera overboard, either as a desperate attempt to preserve the truth or as a final act of defiance by a dying man. I believe it was my grandfather. I believe that while my grandmother was trying to negotiate, trying to save their son, Thomas Hartwell was documenting everything. I believe that when it became clear there would be no deal, when the men with guns moved in, he threw that camera as far as he could, hoping that someday, somehow, the truth would surface. It took 34 years, but it surfaced, armed with the photographs, the evidence from the safe deposit box, and the testimony I had gathered from witnesses across 3 decades, I went to the FBI. I met with an agent named Sarah Chan, who specialized in organized crime cold cases and who had, I learned later, been trying to build a case against the Calabrese family for most of her career. She looked at my evidence. She listened to my story. And then she said something that nearly broke me. It's not enough. The photographs were compelling but circumstantial. A defense lawyer could argue they showed anything, could claim they were staged or doctored or taken out of context. The documents from my grandmother were copies, not originals, and the original records from Meridian shipping no longer existed. The witness testimony was hearsay from elderly people whose memories could be challenged and picked apart by skilled cross-examination. To build a prosecutable case, Agent Chun needed something more. She needed a witness who was there that night. She needed someone from inside the organization who could corroborate what the evidence suggested. She needed, as she put it, a miracle. I had spent 3 years of my life on this. I had sacrificed my career, my marriage, my savings, everything I had. I had come so close to the truth, close enough to see it, close enough to know exactly what had happened to my grandparents and who was responsible. And now I was being told it wasn't enough. The men who murdered Eleanor and Thomas Hartwell were going to die peacefully in their beds, surrounded by their families, never facing justice for what they did. I won't lie to you. I considered giving up. For 3 weeks after that meeting with Agent Chun, I didn't work on the case. I didn't return calls. I didn't look at the files or the photographs or the letters my grandmother wrote to a son who would never read them. I sat in my apartment and stared at the walls and wondered what the point of any of it was. And then I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was old, shaky, male, and immediately familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. Is this Sarah Hartwell? Eleanor's granddaughter. I said it was. I asked who was calling. My name is Michael Reeves. In 1985, I worked security on the MS Celestine. I was there the night your grandparents died, and I've been waiting almost 40 years for someone to ask me what really happened. Michael Reeves was 81 years old. He had stage 4 lung cancer with a prognosis of 3 to 6 months. And he had carried a secret since he was 43, a secret that had cost him his marriage, his relationship with his children, and any hope of sleeping through the night without nightmares. He had been 20 years with the Calabrese organization by then. Started as a runner when he was barely out of high school, worked his way up through enforcement, and eventually landed a position in their legitimate operations as a way to keep a lower profile as he got older. He was on the ship as Vincent Calabrese's personal security, and he was in the room when my grandmother tried to negotiate for her life. Michael Reeves told me everything. Eleanor had brought the money with her, every cent she had taken over the years, in a series of cashier's checks hidden in her luggage. She had also brought copies of the evidence she had gathered, the documents that proved Meridian's connection to the Calabrese family. She offered both in exchange for one thing: her son's safety and her husband's freedom. Vincent Calabrese had laughed. He told her that her son was never in danger, that the threat had been a lie designed to get her onto the ship without resistance. He told her that she had 2 options. She could give him the money and the evidence and go home, keeping her mouth shut for the rest of her life, or she could refuse, and they could have a different kind of conversation. My grandmother chose the first option. She handed over the checks. She handed over the documents. She thought, for a brief moment, that she was going to survive. And then Vincent Calabrese told his men to bring in her husband. Thomas Hartwell had been held in a storage room since boarding, knocked unconscious the night they embarked, and kept sedated for the first 2 days of the cruise. My grandmother hadn't known. She had assumed he was being held as leverage, not that he had already been taken. When they dragged him into the conference room, barely conscious, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, she started screaming. According to Michael Reeves, she screamed so loudly that one of the crew members came to check on the noise. He was paid off and sent away. And then Vincent Calabrese made his decision. She had seen too much, Michael told me. She knew too many names, too many faces. Even if she kept quiet, she was a liability. And your grandfather, he had been taking photographs the whole time he was being held. One of the guards found the camera in his jacket. Calabrese was furious. He ordered them both killed and the bodies dumped at sea. My grandfather, even drugged and injured, had been documenting his captivity. He had known from the moment they took him that he wasn't going to survive, and he had decided to create evidence anyway. He had hidden a second roll of film in his shoe, film that was later destroyed when his body was dumped. But the camera he threw, the camera with the 11 recoverable photographs, that he managed to drop overboard in the chaos of the final moments. The woman went first, Michael said, his voice breaking. She didn't fight. She just looked at her husband and said she was sorry. And then the men pushed her over the rail. My grandfather, Thomas Hartwell, despite being barely conscious, despite being surrounded by armed men, despite knowing that he was going to die, attacked Vincent Calabrese. He got one punch in, Michael said, before they subdued him. But in those few seconds of chaos, he threw the camera as far as he could into the darkness. Then they pushed him over too. Michael Reeves helped dump the bodies. He helped clean the cabin. He helped create the scene that would suggest a suicide, the chair under the door handle, the open balcony, the note forged by one of Calabrese's men who had studied my grandmother's handwriting from the documents she provided. He had been complicit in the murder of my grandparents, and he had lived with that guilt for 39 years. I'm dying, he told me, and I don't want to die with this on my soul. Whatever you need me to do, whatever testimony you need me to give, I'll do it. I owe them that much. I owe you that much. It took me 2 days to set up the meeting with Agent Chun. It took another week for Michael Reeves to be formally interviewed and his testimony recorded. And it took 6 more months for the federal prosecutor's office to determine that, between my evidence and Michael's testimony, they had enough to arrest Vincent Calabrese for the murders of Eleanor and Thomas Hartwell. He was arrested on a Tuesday morning, in his driveway in Boca Raton, in front of his third wife and his gardener and the 2 small dogs he had just taken for a walk. He was 84 years old, and he looked at the federal agents like he couldn't quite believe what was happening, like the past had finally caught up to him and he had no idea how. I was there. I watched them put him in handcuffs. And when they walked him past me, when our eyes met for the first and only time, I said just one thing. Eleanor says hello. The trial began 8 months later and lasted for 3 weeks. Vincent Calabrese's lawyers tried every trick in the book. They challenged Michael Reeves's credibility, pointing out his criminal history and his complicity in the murders. They argued that the photographs were too damaged and too ambiguous to prove anything. They suggested that my grandmother's evidence was manufactured, that I had created elaborate fraud to satisfy some inherited obsession. None of it worked. Michael Reeves took the stand and described that night in excruciating detail. He named the other men who were present, 2 of whom were still alive and were subsequently arrested as accessories. He explained how the Calabrese organization operated, how Meridian Shipping laundered money, how my grandmother's discovery and subsequent theft had created panic at the highest levels. He broke down crying when he described watching Eleanor Hartwell go over the rail, and even the defense lawyers seemed moved by his obvious remorse. The photographs were authenticated by 3 independent experts who testified that they were consistent with 1985 film stock and showed no signs of digital manipulation. A maritime expert confirmed that the currents in that part of the Caribbean would have carried the camera case to approximately where it was found, given 34 years of drift. And a handwriting analyst compared the "Forgive Us" note to verified samples of my grandmother's writing and concluded that it was almost certainly a forgery. I testified for 2 days. I told the jury about my father's decades-long fight for the truth. I told them about the safe deposit box and the documents inside. I told them about the letters my grandmother wrote but never sent, about the evidence she gathered, about the terrible choice she made when she believed her son's life was in danger. And I told them about Thomas Hartwell, about my quiet grandfather who loved crossword puzzles and old westerns, about the man who walked onto that ship knowing something was wrong because he couldn't bear to let his wife face it alone, about the way he fought back even when it was hopeless, even when he was dying, because he refused to go silently into the darkness. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Vincent Calabrese was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, 1 count of money laundering, and 12 counts of racketeering. The other two men, those who had survived long enough to see justice, were convicted of lesser charges as accessories. At sentencing, Vincent Calabrese was asked if he had anything to say. He was 85 by then, frail and diminished, a shadow of the powerful man who had once ordered people killed without a second thought. He looked at me across the courtroom, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been regret. Then he shook his head and said nothing. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die behind bars, just like my father always hoped, just like my grandparents deserved. After the sentencing, Agent Chen found me in the hallway. She looked exhausted but satisfied, the way someone looks when they've finally finished something they started years ago. "Your father would be proud," she said. "You did what he spent his whole life trying to do." I thanked her, but the words felt hollow. Victory was supposed to feel triumphant. Justice was supposed to bring closure. Instead, I just felt tired and sad and hollowed out by years of grief that had nowhere left to go. I went home to Cleveland. I visited my father's grave and told him what had happened, standing in the rain like some kind of movie cliché, speaking to a headstone that couldn't hear me. I told him about Michael Reeves, about the trial, about watching Vincent Calabrese get taken away in handcuffs. I told him that I understood now why he couldn't let it go, why the truth had consumed him even when it cost him everything. And I told him I was sorry. Sorry that I hadn't believed him. Sorry that I had pulled away during the years when he needed support. Sorry that he died without knowing how right he had been. After the rain stopped, I drove to Akron, to the cemetery where my grandparents had empty graves, monuments to people whose bodies were never recovered. I had brought something with me, something I had been carrying for months, waiting for the right moment. The letter Eleanor wrote to my father, the one that was found in the safe deposit box, had been entered into evidence during the trial. But I had made a copy, a careful reproduction of every word, every stroke of her careful handwriting. I read it aloud at her graveside, the first time those words had been spoken since she wrote them 40 years ago. She apologized for the choices she made. She explained the fear and the desperation and the grinding weight of being trapped in something she couldn't escape. She told my father how much she loved him, how every criminal act she committed was done in the hope of giving him a better life, how the threat against him had been the only thing that could make her walk onto that ship. And at the end, she wrote something that made me understand her in a way I never had before. "I am not a good person. I have done terrible things for money that was never mine. But I hope that someday, when all of this is over, you can remember the mother who loved you rather than the woman who failed you. I hope you can forgive me for not being brave enough to do the right thing. And I hope, more than anything, that you never have to make the choices I made." I forgave her, standing there in that quiet cemetery. I forgave Eleanor Hartwell for her crimes and her secrets and the decades of silence that followed her death. I forgave her because she was human, because she was flawed, because she made terrible decisions under impossible pressure and paid for them with her life. And I forgave myself for not believing my father, for pulling away when he needed me, for all the years I spent running from a truth I should have helped him find. There's an epilogue to this story that I haven't told you yet, a final twist that came after the trial, after the conviction, after I thought the whole terrible saga was finally complete. Michael Reeves died 3 months after his testimony. The cancer took him just as the doctors predicted, but he went peacefully, or as peacefully as a man with that kind of history can go. His daughter contacted me after the funeral. She said he had left something for me, something he'd been holding on to since 1985. It was a ring, a simple gold band with a small emerald set in the center. My grandmother's wedding ring, the one she had been wearing when she boarded the MS Celestine. Michael had taken it from her body before they pushed her overboard. He told himself at the time that it was to prevent identification if the body ever surfaced. But the truth, his daughter said, was that he couldn't bear to let her go into the water without someone taking responsibility for remembering her. He had kept that ring for 39 years. He had looked at it every night, a physical reminder of what he had done and what he owed. And now he wanted me to have it, to close the circle, to give Eleanor Hartwell back to her family in whatever small way was still possible. I wear it sometimes now, on a chain around my neck, close to my heart. It's become a way to carry her with me, to remember that she was real, that she lived and loved and made mistakes and died too soon. But that's not the final piece of this story. 6 months after Michael's death, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, old and faded, showing two people I didn't recognize standing on the deck of a ship. A man and a woman, middle-aged, smiling, clearly in love. The ship was the MS Celestine. The date written on the back was June 14th, 1985. Tucked behind the photograph was a note in handwriting I had never seen before. I was the bartender who served your grandmother her last drink. I saw what happened. I was afraid for 40 years. But after the trial, I finally felt safe enough to tell you this. Your grandmother was the bravest person I ever met. In her last moments, when they were about to push her over, she looked at the men holding her and said, "My granddaughter will find you someday, and she will make you pay for this." She was talking about someone who didn't exist yet, but somehow she knew. Somehow she believed. And she was right. I read that note 100 times. I memorized every word, traced every letter with my fingertip, tried to understand how my grandmother could have had that kind of faith in someone she would never meet. And then I realized, she didn't know about me specifically. She didn't know her son would have a daughter who would grow up to be an investigative journalist with the skills and the stubbornness to uncover the truth. But she knew her family. She knew the Hartwells. She knew that we don't give up, don't back down, don't stop fighting until the fight is won. She had faith in us. Even in her final moments, even with death seconds away, she believed that someone would come for her, that someone would see justice done, that the truth, no matter how long it took, would eventually surface. She was right. I'm going to tell you now what I've learned from all of this. What 3 years of investigation, a lifetime of family tragedy, and the final resolution of a 40-year-old mystery have taught me about truth and justice and the things we owe to the people we've lost. First, the truth always wants to be found. It hides and waits and protects itself, but it yearns for discovery. My grandmother left evidence in a safe deposit box that sat untouched for decades. My grandfather threw a camera into the ocean that drifted for 34 years before surfacing. A witness carried his guilt until his dying days and finally found the courage to speak. The truth was patient. The truth endured. And when someone finally came looking, the truth revealed itself. Second, obsession is not the same as love, but sometimes love requires obsession. My father destroyed his life pursuing this case, and for most of my adolescence, I resented him for it. I thought he loved a mystery more than he loved his living family. But I understand now that his obsession was an expression of love, not a substitute for it. He couldn't rest while his parents' murders went unsolved. He couldn't accept a comfortable lie when the truth was still out there, waiting to be found. His obsession cost him everything, but it was born from a love so profound that he couldn't bear to let it go unavenged. Third, justice delayed is not justice denied. It took 40 years, but Eleanor and Thomas Hartwell finally received what they deserved. Their killer will die in prison. Their names have been cleared. Their story has been told. Justice came late, far too late for my father to see, but it came nonetheless. The arc of the moral universe is long, as someone once said, but it bends toward justice. I have seen that arc. I have helped it bend. And I believe now, in a way I never did before, that no crime goes unpunished forever. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, we are more than our worst decisions. My grandmother was an embezzler. She stole from criminals, but she stole nonetheless. She compromised her integrity, her honesty, her professional ethics. She kept secrets from her husband and her son for years. And when the consequences of her choices caught up with her, she paid for them with her life. But she was also a loving wife, a devoted mother, a woman who would walk into certain death to protect her child. She was brave in her final moments, defiant in the face of her killers, faithful in her belief that the truth would someday emerge. She was human, complicated, contradictory, flawed. And she deserves to be remembered for all of it, not just the parts that are easy to forgive. I have spent the last year writing a book about this case. It will be published next spring, with all proceeds going to a cold case advocacy organization that helps families like mine find answers to questions that have haunted them for years. I have also established a scholarship in my grandmother's name at the high school she attended, funded by the settlement I received from the cruise line that covered up her murder for almost 4 decades. And I have started a family. My daughter was born 6 months ago. I named her Eleanor, after a grandmother she will never meet, but whose legacy will always be part of her story. I tell her about the Hartwells every day, about the people we come from and the things they sacrificed and the truth that we fought so hard to find. She's too young to understand, but someday she will. Someday she will know that her great-grandmother was brave and flawed and loved her family more than anything. Someday she will know that her great-grandfather fought until his last breath to leave evidence of what happened to them. Someday she will know that her grandfather, the man she was never able to meet, spent his whole life trying to give his parents the justice they deserved. And someday she will know that her mother finished what he started. I began this story by telling you about an empty cabin and a locked door and 2 champagne glasses that were never touched. I began by asking you to believe that the truth matters, that some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried, that the more people who know, the harder it becomes for them to keep hiding. I'm going to end this story by telling you what I found in the cabin where my grandparents spent their last night alive. After the trial, after Vincent Calabrese was sentenced, I contacted the cruise line that now owns the MS Celestine. The ship is still in service, if you can believe it, though it's been refurbished and renamed and registered in a different country. I told them who I was. I told them what happened in cabin 247, and I asked them for one thing. They let me spend a night in that cabin. Just one night, alone, with my grandmother's ring around my neck and my father's photograph in my pocket. The room looked nothing like it had in 1985. New furniture, new carpet, new wallpaper. The balcony where my grandparents were pushed to their deaths had been expanded and modernized. Everything was different, and nothing was. I sat on the bed where they should have slept. I walked onto the balcony where they took their last breaths. I looked out at the water, black and endless and keeping secrets for decades, and I tried to feel something that would give me closure. What I felt instead was gratitude. Gratitude that my grandmother left evidence behind. Gratitude that my grandfather fought back, even when fighting was hopeless. Gratitude that Michael Reeves found the courage to speak before he died. Gratitude that a fisherman pulled a camera from the ocean and a bartender sent a photograph to a stranger and a bank employee remembered a dormant account and reached out to a woman she'd never met. So many things had to go right for this story to have a happy ending. So many people had to choose courage over silence, truth over convenience, justice over peace. And every single one of them made the right choice, eventually, in the end. I slept that night in cabin 247. For the first time in 3 years, I slept without nightmares. And when I woke up the next morning, I knew that it was finally over. My grandmother's story had been told. My grandfather's sacrifice had been honored. My father's obsession had been vindicated. And the men who killed them would never hurt anyone again. I walked off that ship as the sun was rising over the Caribbean. The water was blue, bluer than any photograph could capture, just like my grandmother wrote in her last postcard. I stood on the dock and watched the light spread across the waves, and I said goodbye. Goodbye to Eleanor, who was braver than she knew. Goodbye to Thomas, who loved her too much to let her face danger alone. Goodbye to my father, who never stopped fighting. And goodbye to the mystery that had defined my family for 4 decades. The truth was finally free. The dead were finally at peace. And I was finally ready to live. This is Sarah Hartwell. And this is the story of what really happened to my grandparents on the MS Celestine in the summer of 1985. Share it. Remember it. And never let anyone tell you that the truth doesn't matter. Because it does. It always does.